Today's session is, as Mark said, we're thinking about posture in terms of just leadership, or another way of thinking about it would be our heart response. I thought before we dug into this a bit more deeply that we would start by just having a quick recap from the last session. It was 2 weeks ago, and I unfortunately missed it. But I just thought it'd be helpful just to have a quick look back to see what we looked at there to frame today's session. Felipe shared then about unpacking some foundations around God's heart for justice and why a heart for justice is so important to how we can lead. And there were sort of three key takeaways from that in terms of aspects. One is that just leadership is centered in God. This idea that it's not within our own strength or something that we do by ourselves, but that actually, as we seek to lead with justice and integrity, we should be centered, anchored in our relationship with God. Secondly, that just leadership is not just about doing justice, it's about being just. This is not a list of techniques or checkboxes. This is about our beliefs, about character, what drives and guides us. And the question really is, how do we allow justice and our understanding of justice to shape us and our leadership approach? And then thirdly, that just leadership is modelled after Jesus. A reminder that not only is leadership centred in God, but God has given us a perfect model in the life and ministry of Jesus. So today we are thinking more about how we cultivate our heart, our responses, which help us to reflect justice in the way we lead and encourage others. As I've just mentioned, it's not a checklist or a self-help personal improvement list. While we can work to cultivate these attributes, it's not something that we can achieve in our own strength, but rather foundationally to be deeply rooted in our relationship with God. As we invest in our relationship with God, as we go deeper in faith and understanding of God and who He is, and as we allow Him to transform our heart attitudes and desires, we will begin to reflect more authentically His heart and His character to those around us. So how might we seek to cultivate an approach of attitude of justice and integrity within our leadership? As part of this series, we've been looking at a book called Just Leadership, which has provided some inspiration around this series. And in that book, the authors comment that God has come close in the person of Jesus Christ. This is not a matter of justice being at the heart of the character of God, but of God coming up close and personal to injustice in human form, and having experienced the emotions, the heartbreak, the pain, and the agony of seeing injustice and experiencing injustice. We have this reminder that Jesus has come and lived among us, that He has experienced both the justice and injustice that we find within this world. And so I want to actually just start there before we dig into kind of our heart response and think about the model we have in Jesus. Last time we looked at the passage in John where Jesus washes His disciples' feet, and it talks of servant leadership. It's a powerful image, but I want us to consider another story from Jesus's life today, and that is the feeding of the 5,000 that we find in Matthew. Here we see Jesus is being pursued by crowds of people, so He stops to spend time with them. Time passes and becomes evening, and Jesus and the disciple end up feeding more than 5,000 people. There's not a straightforward comparison with our everyday. I was trying to think of a good analogy for today, but I suspect if we were at a conference, perhaps we'd been invited to speak, we're at this conference and the caterer's cancelled at the last minute, or there's a fire in the kitchens. I'm not sure we would necessarily think, first of all, to look for who had food. We'd pick up the phone and there'd be takeaways and other restaurants who could no doubt be enlisted to plug the gap. However, there probably are situations that we find ourselves in where, where things happen, where we might have be pulled into a tricky client meeting at the last minute. It significantly overruns, shows no sign of finishing. how might we facilitate a constructive drawing to that end and moving forward in a way that the client feels heard and that we can move forward with the case? Or perhaps as a team, you've been working many hours on closing a deal or finalising bundles, only for there to be a power cut. The team seem a bit off. How do you respond to that? What's our response? How do we meet people in that? As we see in Matthew's account, there's a few things we can draw out from this, and we're going to use this as we go through today. So first of all, in verse 14, he lands, he sees the crowd, and so he stops. He has compassion. He listens to them. And we see an outworking of that is then he brings healing to those that are sick. He made time to listen and find out where they were at, what their needs were, but also what's distracting them. In thinking about godly leadership, there's a challenge here to not allow our focus on the task to blind us to the needs of those around us who we are encouraging and long to serve, while also making sure we don't become too distracted from the role that we have. He was generous too. We see that earlier on, just before this section of the passage, we learn about John the Baptist's death at the hands of Herod, which in verse 2 we're told was prompted because Herod had heard of Jesus and his ministry and, wanted to deal with that, so had arrested John the Baptist. Jesus had withdrawn, we see in the verse here, privately to a solitary place to pray, perhaps to grieve, to reflect. But when he saw the crowds, he recognized their need as well. And then later on, we see that sort of generosity in the way that he seeks the multiplication, the miraculous multiplication of the 2 loaves and 5 fishes. He's also quite generous too in the way he involves the disciples and the children, those that bring the 5 loaves and 2 fish we see in other accounts, the way he involves them in this as well. He's not just about leading by himself, but bringing others with him. We see great humility. It must have been quite tempting, perhaps for humans would be quite tempting to have such a confidence boost, to be followed by such great crowds and sought out. And yet his initial thoughts are those of compassion, of serving others. He wants to involve others as well. And he gives recognition that it's not in his own strength that he operates, but through God we see him giving glory and praise and blessing the food before the multiplication. And then finally, there's also courage that we want to talk about today. So thinking about courage. As I was thinking about this, it's weird. I don't think I've ever stopped to think about how much Jesus might have felt fear. And yet, because it's very easy to think, well, he knew what was going to happen and he had confidence and so he could step out. But, Jesus was fully human. And so he still had to choose to step out. In this situation, he knew that Herod was riled by his work, had just killed his cousin. He'd already encountered difficulties with the Pharisees and ruffling of feathers of the religious leaders. And yet he continued to step out and serve, trusting that God would move and provide. I think the other thing that we see here is that he bookends this with time with God. And as we were reminded last time, the importance of relationship with God, to be rooted in that. There's a helpful reminder that it's not just a public declaration of trust in God's provision and goodness, but also the importance of regular private times with God our Father. Jesus' ministry was rooted in the relationship with God. And I guess my question for us today, our first question really is, are we rooting ourselves in God? Because much of what I will talk about as this session goes on really is drawn from our relationship with God. And are we cultivating that relationship with time in his word, seeking his wisdom and counsel? And I guess my hope is if you take nothing else from today, I'd encourage you to keep cultivating that relationship with God, because through drawing closer to him, you are going to have a greater understanding of his heart and desire, his love for justice, and that will reflect much more authentically through the way that you conduct yourself in your workplaces. But let's maybe dig into this a little bit more. And so thinking about sort of the posture of Jesus, we've just sort of run through that. Thinking about one anothering is my first thought. Thinking about relationships. The book, for those of you that might have looked at the book, it's called Proximity. It felt like a one anothering. Let me ask you a question. This is about leadership. And so what do we see as our role as leaders? To lead, you might say, but to lead whom or what? I think it's helpful to be reminded that leadership involves relationships at its heart. It's about mobilizing people towards a common goal or direction, making decisions, gathering consensus. And yet so often, particularly in our environment, there can be much focus on the goal rather than on the people. And this can lead to unhealthy or broken relationships. Now, what might that have to do with justice? Brian Myers, writer of the book Walking with the Poor, comments that broken relationships really do have a connection with poverty and injustice. He reflects that that poverty and injustice are caused by a series of broken relationships with God, which we will know when we are not prioritizing a relationship with God. We lack spiritual intimacy and understanding of God's heart. We become more selfish and focused on our own needs. When we don't make time for ourselves to culture healthy habits, then we run the risk of illness or of burnout. We don't prioritize our rest. When we allow our relationships with others to not grow and cultivate, it can be very isolating, and we see sort of breakdown and miscommunication. He also links it with creation, that when our relationship with creation is broken, that it impacts the stewardship, that we are not stewarding our resources as well as we could. I think as lawyers, we can see this. I mean, many areas of law are about helping others to navigate situations and consequences caused by the breakdown of relationships. Or we might find ourselves working with others to build frameworks in order for relationships to function, providing scope for how to deal with disagreement or conflict. Whether you're dealing with family, employment, criminal, civil disputes, or indeed drafting contracts or wills, the practice of law is built largely around relational frameworks. And so we understand broken relationships can impact justice, can impact the practice of justice. So what's the key factor here? How do we build relationships in a leadership context that allow us to lead with justice and integrity? Jesus' life and ministry demonstrates a consistent care and compassion for others, whether eating with prostitutes and tax collectors, spending time with the disciples, engaging with individuals in need of healing and acceptance. He was never too busy nor task-focused to make time to listen and to engage. However, crucially, he also never allowed them to detract from his ministry, instead wove it into his wider mission. So while he made time to listen and care, he was still clear on salvation. And so what we can see here is that there is a real call for us, even in the midst of billable time, competing demands, and busy workloads, to think about how we build in a care for others, a care for how we can lead well. A lack of understanding of where others are at, what our clients want, perhaps really want, not just what they say they want, can lead to wasted time and unhelpful approaches in the case. Perhaps if we gently probe, we may find that some underlying concern suddenly comes to the surface and draws out the real issue, allowing more constructive conversation going forward. So I'd encourage you to think about pausing, to listen, not just to what's being said, but to maybe what's not being said, to observing, to meeting people where they're at, asking open questions, and seeking to stay on course. You have your focus on where we're going, but being open to change depending on as the information comes through. Theodore Roosevelt, we were talking about historical leaders. Roosevelt has been credited with saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This might be a sentiment you recognise in yourself, but I think this comes alongside this idea that particularly with clients, but also with colleagues, that actually when they feel reassured that they've been seen and listened to, they're much more engaged in where we want to go and how we move forward. So how do we help our clients and colleagues to feel seen, listened to in order to serve them well? Secondly, I want to touch on generosity. Tim Keller, in his book Generous Justice, describes generosity as one of the hallmarks of living justly. We also see generosity in the Bible being often interlinked with justice and the themes of justice. We see in Isaiah 58, the kind of fasting that God has chosen in this section is not just to loose the chains of injustice, but also to share food with the hungry, to provide for those in need of shelter, of clothes, and not turn people away. Having a generous heart allows something of God and generosity of God to be reflected. Now, when we speak of generosity, I find that can often turn to the thought of money and giving, and that is good. But I think there's much more to that when we think in the terms of leadership. How can we be generous with our time, our resources, and our gifting, recognizing that we're part of a wider body? But also, I don't think that necessarily calls us to give freely to everything all the time. Jesus himself had boundaries. He didn't manage to heal everyone. There are times when he withdrew from the crowd for time on his own. So God calls us to exercise wisdom. And we can recognize too that when we spread ourselves too thinly, we can end up doing less good, or indeed causing harm. If we were to accept, for example, every new referral for pro bono, we reach a point where we have no paid work to be able to cover the overheads. So how do we cultivate an attitude of generosity? I think there's three things that we can think about in this. One is to be intentional. It's that we give not just because we've been asked to do, but because it's the right to do so. It's good, it's right to give. God is a generous giver. How can we give? But let us be focused. Let us be focused in the way that we give. Ask the why. What is it? How will my giving in this way help? And how does it fit with the wider goal and service? As we've said previously, giving to anything and everything might mean that you spread yourself too thinly. And boundaries can be healthy. It can be healthy to say, if I say yes to this, then what am I saying no to? And part of that is about honouring the commitments that you've made, to having that integrity in the way that you lead. And thirdly, to have empathy and perspective. In Acts 3, we see the man that has been lame from birth. He asks for alms from Peter and John. Instead of giving him money, they engage with him. They say, look at us, give us your full attention. And then they pray for him and command him to stand and walk. And he walks into the temple with them. Sometimes the best solution is not the immediate ask, but is finding the creative solution that addresses the situation now and into the longer term. What might this look like for us within our legal profession? Perhaps that is thinking about how we prioritise our time and that of the teams we serve. How do we encourage generosity? Or indeed, how do we encourage our colleagues and those that we lead to think about healthy boundary setting and how they can serve? The other aspect to this is we recognise that actually allowing others to serve us, that there's a generosity in allowing our thinking and our leadership to be influenced and guided by others around us. We're not infallible. We don't have all the answers nor skills, even though we might like to. And where we might lack that insight or skill, others can serve and equip the wider community. Are we looking out for those who we can bring in, who can equip and build up, that we might strengthen and encourage them too? Thirdly, power and humility. The word power sort of sits a little uncomfortable with me, but Gary Haugen in Good News About Injustice talks about how injustice is the abuse of power. I'm sure we can all think of examples we've either seen personally or from the news where positions of power and authority have been misused, causing injustice or harm. In contrast, the right exercise of power can lead to justice and restored relationships. Power and influence are truly valued and sought after in our society, and we know that our legal profession is not exempt from this. Our concepts of leadership and success are often tied up with securing more power and influence. And yet, when we look at the Bible, we see Jesus, and he demonstrates to us that a godly sense of leadership is not about power, but is about coming to serve. It's about humility. And in this topsy-turvy world, how might we lead with humility and service? I feel like sometimes we have a misunderstanding when it comes to humility. We expect it to be about being timid or acting as a doormat. However, I feel like Philippians gives us a much better framework in which to operate. In Philippians, it calls us to do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than ourselves. Let us, each of us, look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among you, which is yours in Christ Jesus. So we're to be mindful of others. We're to count others as more significant as ourselves. But crucially too, we look both to our own interests and the interests of others. How can we serve with humility and care for those around us? How do we use our positions of power and influence to be able to serve and love others? Dan Cable, in his article, How Humble Leadership Really Works, observed that humility and servant leadership do not imply that leaders have low self-esteem or take on an attitude of civility. Instead, servant leadership emphasizes that the responsibility of a leader is to increase the ownership, autonomy, and responsibility of followers, to encourage them to think for themselves and try out their own ideas. I would suggest that to cultivate an attitude of humility, we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to recognize our own strengths and limitations. But secondly, key, we should find our security and identity in God, that we root ourselves in God, in humility, recognizing we're not perfect, and yet God is. And finding our security in our identity in God then actually frees us up. We're free to care for others, to consider others, and to have a greater resilience for both the successes and the challenges that will inevitably come. So how are we creating a culture where others can flourish? And finally, I'm going to just cover courage as well. Franklin Roosevelt has kind of featured a couple of times today, not intentionally, but I thought these quotes were quite helpful when we think about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, he said, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. Nelson Mandela perhaps even more succinctly put it as, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And then in Joshua, these familiar words from God to Joshua, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. To lead with justice and integrity requires courage. Now, this doesn't have to look like Joshua, being a commander of an army going into battle with a battle cry, but it does require intentionality and resilience. It may require a risk of losing face, a risk of losing much more than just face as well. But it's a risk, but it's a risk worth taking when it's with God. I wanted to share with you just briefly a story about an LCF friend who served within a key civil service role in Eastern Europe. His role was to help the government tackle corruption, and he was reporting directly to the relevant government minister. He refused to accept bribes, which unfortunately was quite commonplace in his country. However, he got a new boss who didn't believe that he wasn't taking bribes. And when he established that that was indeed the truth, that our friend was a person of integrity, he wasn't happy because unfortunately the new boss wanted a share of everyone's bribes they were collecting. As a result, our friend was fired from his role. And speaking with him many months later, while he was still unemployed and he had a young family, he shared that next time he wouldn't be so bold as to put his head above the parapet again in a work context. I gently asked, how did that accord with his faith? Did that mean that he would now accept bribes or have more of a blurred? And almost offended, he immediately responded and said, no, I will not accept bribes, as that would be to betray my Lord and Saviour. He was adamant that while he had been burnt in the process, he would not compromise. And I'm confident that actually, should that situation rise again, that he has and will continue to have the quiet courage and conviction to stand, because his faith and his integrity and justice that he believes in from his faith are so strong. There's a real confidence in being able to stand like that. And while we might not face such a challenge, I do wonder where we've been called to be bold today. What is it that we perhaps are fearful of? And how does this shape our heart approach to leading with justice and integrity? Maybe we're fearful of trusting God with that. Maybe we need the courage to allow God in to shape our decision making and our practice. And so I think we're going to close there and go into a time of discussion groups. We've got some discussion questions. Do feel free to take a screenshot if that's helpful. Hopefully you all received them yesterday on email as well. But just as we kind of come to close, I'm reminded of Micah 6:8 and felt really, it's a verse familiar to LCFers, that what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And my prayer for us is that as we seek to walk humbly with God, he will shape our hearts and desires to become more like him. In putting God first, we can cultivate more deeply a love and wisdom for others, a spirit of wise generosity, of humble leadership and courage that enables us to lead with justice and integrity.